Adam, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Now, the UAE has labeled any attempt by Israel to annex the West Bank a red line that could undermine the Abraham Accords. How historic or unusual is this level of rebuke from a Gulf partner to Israel?
Well, it's not unusual for Israel's neighbors to condemn Jerusalem in some way. We know that Israel is in a neighborhood that is not very friendly. But what matters here is that the UAE is actually quite exceptional in the region in that it has normalized its relationship with Israel through the 2020 Abraham Accords. So the Abraham Accords are a document that essentially has allowed Israel to normalize its relationship with an ever-growing number of partners in the region. For example, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, uh, under this notion that they benefit from working together. And one thing I do want to stress is that these countries that want to normalize their relationship with Israel tend to be a bit more autocratic. They're usually monarchies, and they fear Islamic radicalism, specifically if it's Shiite, right? And many of these people are Sunnis. And so for them to work with Israel is a way for them to contain some of the more radical elements in their society and, for example, protect their countries from interference from Iran. Now, when Israel and the UAE normalized their relationship in 2020, one of the stipulations was that Israel would not try to annex the West Bank. And so at the time, Netanyahu said, I'm going to put those plans on pause. I'm not going to annex the West Bank. But lo and behold, 5 years later, he's done a 180 and he's saying, haha, no, I'm going to actually annex 80% of the West Bank. And what are you going to do about it? And this is the UAE pushing back, saying that they clearly set conditions here and those conditions are not being met.
And what practical steps might the UAE take and can deliver on its warning if annexation proceeds?
I mean, diplomatic isolation is a big part of this, right? So we have to keep in mind that Israel right now is increasingly isolated, sometimes for unjustified reasons and sometimes for justified reasons. And I think that, annexing the West Bank would create justifiable blowback. So if you have, for example, if you have increased hostility towards Israel from some of its neighbors, then that might mean less security cooperation for the next conflict with Iran, for example. And the UAE right now is not militarily a significant power. I mean, it's a wealthy nation, it has a lot of oil wealth, but it's very small. But the question here is whether or not they can influence some of the other states, for example, Jordan, right? And so what happens here is that if you have like the UAE, saying we're going to be anti-Israel again, and other countries becoming increasingly anti-Israel, then who's going to shoot down Iranian drones and missiles on their way to Tel Aviv the next time a war breaks out between the two? You have to think about things in the long run.
And if annexation proceeds, what does it mean for the future of a viable Palestinian state?
I mean, it basically means the death of a two-state solution because the annexation plan, which is being proposed right now, is one that doesn't really allow for a viable Palestinian state. So when you think about the West Bank, a lot of it is kind of uninhabited or very sparsely inhabited. And then you have a series of settlements of Palestinian settlements like Bethlehem, Jericho, Ramallah, Jenin. And so, you know, with this annexation plan, essentially Israel would take 80% of the land, so all the land between these cities, and they would basically be just turned into little islands, right? And there's no way you can have a viable two-state solution when your state is a series of island cities, basically city-states that are kind of federated together but don't really have any access to each other. Also, an important thing to note here is that Netanyahu's government now wants to annex Bethlehem and the surrounding area, and Bethlehem right now is predominantly Palestinian. And so if you annex a Palestinian city, uh, the Palestinians are not going to take kindly to that. So I think that there would be an increase in radicalization, and you would see the West Bank just blow up in more conflict. Now, one thing we should stress is that the West Bank has been, for the most part, fairly peaceful these past few years. Gaza has always been a bit of a basket case. And when I was in the West Bank earlier this year, one of the things that I heard often is how the West Bankers often felt different and better than the Gazans because the Gazans chose war and then they ended up living in poverty and now their strip is in ruin, whereas the West Bankers chose diplomacy, got a certain degree of autonomy, and actually managed to live economically quite well. They felt proud about the fact that, for example, they were often wealthier than Jordanians living in Jordan. But if you have full-on annexation, I can't imagine how Palestinians living in the West Bank would accept continued peaceful coexistence with the Israelis. And so you could see the West Bank turning into another Gaza-like problem. We know, for example, that in Hebron, which is the biggest city in the West Bank, there's already, a fair amount of Hamas supporters. I think some of the informal estimates I heard from some of my contacts was around 30%, but, don't quote me on that. That's very informal. But that is currently, where the bastion of Hamas support is in that region. Now, imagine if you take that and you just explode that and metastasize it everywhere. Well, then you have a huge security issue for Israel, and that's not going to be good for anyone.
And what is the Israeli justification for taking more of the West Bank?
There are a variety of justifications, some of which are more ideological, some of which are more practical, right? So on the more extreme end, we have to keep in mind that for the Israeli far right, they view this as a religious project, as their destiny to take over all of this land. And so they've always aspired to annex all of the West Bank for the far right. And this is them just, enacting this long-standing plan. Now, historically, they haven't really had the political capital to do this, but they have had that capital recently because Netanyahu's coalition government is quite weak. And so he has had to partner with some very dodgy far-right parties to stay in power. And now they have outsized influence on policymaking, and they can push for annexation because the alternative is that they withdraw their support and then the coalition falls and then Netanyahu loses power and then, could perhaps go to jail for his various corruption problems. Like he's supposed to go to trial at some point. On a practical level, I think the idea is that with Gaza now mostly in ruins, and with there being no real hope right now for the near future of Israel, being respected by the rest of the world, unfortunately, because I think that, most Israelis are quite great. Some of the more radical elements of Netanyahu's government has said, well, you know what? We're already disliked. This is our last chance to do this. So let's go for it. And we can secure our territorial integrity by annexing this land. I disagree with that. I think that's really stupid. But we have to keep in mind that some of these people are really radical extremists.
And do we have any indication on how countries like Canada or the US might respond?
I mean, Canada will hate it, absolutely. I mean, we've already condemned some of we already condemned the settlements in the West Bank because they're illegal. I think the main problem here would be the United States. So the United States is, Israel's biggest ally. They were indispensable in crippling Iran earlier this year. And for the most part, Americans are very pro-Israel, at least the ones on the right. And they have a lot of moral clarity here, and they know that Israel is fighting for its existence, and that's okay, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there are also certain limits, because many people also care about the self-determination of Palestinians and the fact that they deserve to have dignity too. And so if you were to have an annexation of 80% of the West Bank, that would be very diplomatically destabilizing, and you could probably see a major pushback in the U.S., and that could lead to a significant reduction in military support for Israel, and then that would leave Israel once again more vulnerable going forward.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you for having me.